the summer of 1941, the world held its breath. Operation Barbarossa, the German blitzkrieg against the Soviet Union, had shattered the fragile peace of the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact. Fueled by meticulous preparation and a chillingly effective doctrine of combined arms warfare, the Wehrmacht stormed across the plains of Eastern Europe. 3 massive army groups sliced through the Soviet frontier, and at the northern tip of this colossal spearhead was Army Group North, its ultimate prize shimmering on the horizon: Leningrad. The city of Peter the Great, the cradle of the Bolshevik Revolution, was not merely a strategic objective, it was a symbol. For Hitler, its annihilation was paramount. As German armor and infantry tightened their iron grip, establishing a formidable siege perimeter around the city, the Soviet defenders faced a harrowing choice. The ghosts of 1940, of a France that had crumbled in mere weeks, haunted the halls of the Smolny Institute. But this was not France. This was Russia. The Stavka, the Soviet High Command, resolved that there would be no capitulation, no retreat into the annals of a swift and humiliating defeat. In the face of overwhelming odds, they would forge a defense of unparalleled ferocity. For 2 long, agonizing years, as the German siege lines solidified into a seemingly unbreakable wall, the Red Army and the citizens of Leningrad would devise and execute a series of brilliant, desperate, and heroic defensive strategies. They would endure the unendurable, waiting, watching, and praying for that golden moment, the opportunity to unleash a counteroffensive that would not just break the siege, but blow the specter of fascism back to the gates of Berlin. The legend of Georgy Konstantinovich Zhukov was already being forged in the fires of Khalkhin Gol, but it was at the gates of Leningrad that it would be tempered into steel. On September 9, 1941, a date that would forever be etched into the city's history, the man who would become the Soviet Union's most celebrated Marshal received an urgent summons. The situation at Leningrad was not just dire, it was catastrophic. The front, under the command of the politically connected but tactically inept Marshal Clement Voroshilov, was disintegrating. Panic was setting in, and the city's fall seemed not a matter of if, but when. Receiving his orders directly from the Kremlin, from Stalin himself, Zhukov embarked on a frantic, non-stop journey, traveling day and night by air and land. He arrived in a city shrouded in smoke and fear. His mission was absolute: replace Voroshilov, assume direct command of the Leningrad front, and hold the city at any cost. There was no room for failure. The moment he stepped into the command bunker at the Smolny Institute, the atmosphere crackled with a new, terrifying energy. The chair he was to occupy was, as the saying goes, not yet warm when he convened an emergency meeting of the front's command staff. What followed was not a polite discussion, but a brutal, hours-long interrogation and strategic vivisection. The air grew thick with tension as Zhukov, with his trademark bluntness and piercing gaze, tore apart the existing defense plans. He pointed out, with chilling precision, every single catastrophic error made in the opening phase of the defense. The poorly coordinated retreats, the failure to establish layered anti-tank defenses, the squandering of reserve forces, and the pervasive sense of defeatism that had allowed the Germans to seize an almost absolute tactical advantage. This was not a man who dealt in excuses, he dealt in solutions. In that same marathon session, Zhukov began to sketch out the framework of a new reality for Leningrad. His mind, a furious engine of tactical brilliance, immediately conceived of a plan not just to halt the German advance, but to make every inch of ground they sought to gain a meat grinder. His plan was a masterpiece of defensive doctrine, born of desperation and genius. He was, in every sense, the antithesis of Hitler's hubris, the true nemesis of the Wehrmacht. Zhukov's strategy was multifaceted. First, he ordered the immediate establishment of a deep, layered defense in depth, turning the city's suburbs into a fortress. Every street, every building, every pile of rubble was to become a strong point. Second, he demanded the creation of a massive interlocking network of anti-tank obstacles and artillery kill zones, specifically designed to counter the panzer divisions that spearheaded the German assault. Third, and perhaps most crucially, he ordered the mobilization of every able-bodied man and woman to construct fortifications and, simultaneously, to form a new strategic reserve. This was to be a long war, a war of attrition, and Leningrad would be ready. With the ink on his orders barely dry, the new defense plan was being implemented with ferocious speed. The gaping holes in the Soviet lines, which had invited German breakthroughs, were being plugged by the sheer force of Zhukov's will and the brilliance of his military mind. The defensive perimeter was no longer a brittle shell, but a resilient, formidable bulwark braced for the inevitable steel fist of the German assault. The test came almost immediately. On September 10th, after days of regrouping and softening up the Soviet lines with a merciless aerial and artillery bombardment, Army Group North launched its next major offensive. Stuka dive bombers screamed from the heavens, heavy guns roared, and waves of German infantry surged forward, expecting to crash through the last vestiges of resistance. But they were met with a wall of fire. Zhukov's plan instantly proved its worth. Acting on his preemptive orders, the Leningrad Front Command had already redeployed a new armored brigade to the most threatened sector. The German attack, which would have shattered Voroshilov's lines days earlier, slammed into a well-prepared and unyielding defense. The Soviet tanks, though often outmatched individually, fought with savage determination, turning the tide of the initial assault. The battle raged for a week of unbelievable intensity. On the seventh day, with the Germans on the verge of a breakthrough and the city's fate hanging by a thread, the front command was forced to play its final card. Every last reserve unit they possessed was hurled into a desperate counterattack. In a move of supreme risk, Zhukov ordered the majority of the city's anti-aircraft batteries, the only defense against the Luftwaffe's reign of terror, to be dismounted, lowered to horizontal firing positions, and moved to the front lines to act as direct-fire anti-tank guns. The effect was devastating. The German formations were torn to shreds. Concentrated artillery fire, now expertly directed, rained down on the advancing troops, turning disciplined columns into a chaotic landscape of death and destruction. Mighty armored spearheads that had seemed invincible only moments before were transformed into smoldering pyres of twisted metal and charred remains. The ground became a carpet of bodies. After 8 days of relentless, frenzied attacks, the Wehrmacht was exhausted and bloodied. Seizing the initiative, the Soviet 54th Army launched a flanking counterattack to the southeast of Leningrad. This move, while costly, forced the German High Command to halt its direct assault on the city's core defenses and divert forces to meet this new threat. Yet, the reprieve was short-lived. Marshal Wilhelm von Leeb, commander of Army Group North, under pressure from Hitler, adapted his strategy. Recognizing the formidable new leadership under Zhukov, he shifted the main axis of his attack. He concentrated his forces towards the town of Tikhvin and launched a powerful offensive towards the Schlisselburg fortress south of Lake Ladoga. The objective was clear: to sever the last land connection the 54th Army had with the main Leningrad front, thereby completely encircling the city. The maneuver was a brutal success. The 54th Army was cut off, and the Leningrad front suffered a devastating strategic blow. With its flank no longer threatened, the German army could now pull the noose impossibly tight. They advanced into Pushkin and Slutsk, sealing the city in a ring of steel. The blockade was complete. Inside the besieged city of Leningrad, a new war began. A war far more insidious and personal than the one fought with tanks and artillery. For the Red Army soldiers and the 3 million civilians trapped alongside them, the enemy was no longer just the German soldier at the gate. It was the gnawing emptiness in their stomachs and the bone-deep chill that crept into their homes. It was a war against hunger and cold. The German encirclement was absolute. Every railway line leading into the city was in Wehrmacht hands, severing Leningrad from the vast resources of the Soviet heartland. The Soviet High Command, desperate to help, found itself utterly powerless to send relief. The lifeline was cut. The consequences were immediate and cruel. Rations, already meager, were slashed again and again. In the beginning, a manual laborer, the lifeblood of the city's war effort, was allocated a daily ration of 600 grams of bread. Soon, this was a distant memory. The numbers plummeted. An office worker or a child would receive 400 grams, then 300. The German bombing campaign specifically targeted food supplies. A devastating raid on the Badaevsky warehouses incinerated thousands of tons of flour, grain, and sugar, sending a column of black, greasy smoke into the sky, a funeral pyre for the city's hopes. If the blizzards sweeping down from Siberia had been the heralds of a great turning point at Stalingrad and Moscow, for Leningrad they were the winds of damnation. The first winter of the siege, 1941–42, was one of the most brutal in recorded history. The snow-laden winds did not just bring cold, they blew open the gates to a terrestrial hell. At the food distribution points, the tragic theater of survival played out daily. People, gaunt and hollow-eyed, would wait for hours in the freezing cold for their pathetic allotment. The situation became so desperate that bakers and distributors began using tiny jeweler's scales, the kind used for weighing gold and precious stones, to ensure that not a single gram of bread was wasted. A single gram of bread, dark and dense with additives, had become more precious than gold. Soon, even that bread was a mockery of its name. To extend the dwindling flour supplies, bakers mixed in sawdust, cellulose, pine needles, and even sweepings from the factory floors. The Germans knew that hunger was Leningrad's fatal weakness, its Achilles heel. The Luftwaffe made a concerted effort to hunt down and destroy any attempt to bring in supplies. The few barges that braved the waters of Lake Ladoga were strafed and bombed relentlessly. Yet the people's will was not so easily broken. Red Army divers in the freezing waters would plunge into the lake to salvage sacks of wet, sunken grain from bombed-out barges, which would then be dried and baked into bitter, life-sustaining bread. Even the oats and processed cake intended as horse feed were requisitioned, ground into a coarse flour, and distributed to the populace. This slow, agonizing starvation continued unabated until the spring of 1943. A small glimmer of hope emerged when citizens, under the strict protection of infantry patrols, began planting vegetable gardens in every available patch of soil, in city parks, in public squares, and even in the craters left by German bombs. These small victory gardens were a testament to their unyielding defiance. Alongside hunger stalked its twin, the cold. In a modern industrial war fought in the brutal sub-zero temperatures of a Russian winter, fuel is the lifeblood of survival and resistance. The German blockade had cut off all supplies of coal and oil. The city's power plants sputtered and died. The lights went out. The trams stopped. The great industrial metropolis was plunged into a primitive darkness. In the midst of this frozen hell, the only source of heat for the besieged population was wood. In early October, the city council and military command made a heart-wrenching decision. They authorized the systematic felling of every tree in the city's northern parks and forests. Soon, the parks were barren. Then, people began burning their furniture, their books, their floorboards, anything that could provide a flicker of warmth against the encroaching Arctic night. By late November, even this last resort was nearly exhausted. The lack of heating fuel transformed the Russian winter from a strategic advantage into an instrument of mass death. For 2 consecutive winters, from 1941 to 1943, the people of Leningrad endured the harshest conditions the Arctic Circle could unleash. Living in a state of constant gnawing hunger and freezing cold, their bodies simply gave out. In the first winter alone, over 600,000 civilians perished. They died in their frozen apartments. They collapsed in the bread lines. They fell on the streets while trying to fetch water from holes cut in the ice of the Neva River. Leningrad became the single deadliest place of the entire Second World War, a city of ghosts entombed in ice. To be besieged for months on end meant being cut off from the world. For the Soviet forces in Leningrad, all direct communication with the Stavka was severed. The only tenuous link was the perilous water route across Lake Ladoga, a route constantly harassed by German aircraft and long-range artillery. Adolf Hitler, obsessed with the city's destruction, issued a direct order to his naval command: approach this city and demolish it, using artillery of all calibers and constant bombing from the air. Prevented from bringing their battleships into the Gulf of Finland by the dense minefields laid by the Soviet Baltic Fleet, the Germans opted for a different kind of naval power. They transported their most formidable siege artillery by rail to the southern and southwestern outskirts of Leningrad. This included monstrous guns with calibers ranging from 180 mm to the colossal 420 mm Gamma Merger, weapons designed to pulverize fortresses. For months, these guns hurled a relentless storm of steel into the city. The Luftwaffe, for the most part, owned the skies. Over the course of the 872-day siege, the Germans would fire approximately 150,000 artillery shells into Leningrad and drop over 100,000 incendiary and 4,600 high-explosive bombs. Their goal was to turn the city into an uninhabitable field of rubble. Yet, in a profound and bitter irony, the very destruction they wrought became their undoing. When the German command ordered its infantry to advance into the city for the final kill, they found themselves facing an impossible landscape. The mountains of rubble, the skeletal remains of apartment blocks, and the cratered streets that their own bombs and shells had created became the Red Army's greatest defensive asset. The soldiers of Leningrad, hardened by starvation and loss, transformed these ruins into a labyrinthine network of interconnected strongpoints. Every pile of bricks was a potential machine gun nest. Every shattered window was a sniper's perch. The fighting devolved from open battle into a brutal, close-quarters guerrilla war, the very type of warfare in which the Red Army excelled. The long, straight avenues designed by the Tsars became deadly fields of fire. Soviet snipers, armed with their superb SVT-40 semi-automatic rifles, exacted a heavy toll on German officers and machine gun crews. Small squads armed with grenades and Molotov cocktails would emerge from sewers and basements, striking hard and fast, before melting back into the cityscape of ruins. The towering apartment buildings, now hollowed-out shells, became elevated fortresses from which mortars and anti-tank rifles could rain death down upon the attackers. The German blitzkrieg, a doctrine built on speed and maneuver, ground to a halt, choked by the very debris of its own creation. While this shadow war raged in the streets, another, equally vital battle was being fought in the city's factories. The logistical rear, or till, was not in some distant city, but right there, at the front, na mieste. The spirit of resilience was embodied by the city's workers. In the early days of the siege, over 500,000 civilians, mostly women, the elderly, and teenagers, had mobilized to dig hundreds of kilometers of trenches and anti-tank ditches. They erected massive barriers of barbed wire, concrete dragon teeth, and steel hedgehogs, and built thousands of reinforced concrete bunkers and wooden earthen firing points. Despite the near-total lack of raw materials and fuel and the constant threat of bombardment, Leningrad's legendary factories, the Kirov, the Izharsky, the Obukhov, did not fall silent. Production was dramatically scaled back, and many skilled workers and machines had been evacuated, but those who remained worked with a superhuman resolve. In freezing, unlit workshops, starving workers operating on sheer willpower continued to produce and repair weapons. They assembled T-34 and KV-1 tanks, cannons, mortars, machine guns, submachine guns, and rifles. They churned out millions of rounds of ammunition. The ingenuity was staggering. Damaged military hardware was dragged from the battlefield, cannibalized for parts, and painstakingly repaired to be sent back into the fight. Though completely isolated from the rest of the Soviet Union, the defenders of Leningrad were determined not to be passive victims. They would forge their own salvation. The German assumption that a lack of heavy weapons would lead to a swift collapse proved catastrophically wrong. Throughout the siege, the factories of Leningrad produced an astonishing arsenal: 8 armored trains, over 3,000 anti-tank guns, nearly 10,000 artillery pieces and mortars of all calibers, and over 3 million artillery shells. This industrial miracle, performed in the jaws of hell, not only sustained the city's defense, but laid the groundwork for the eventual glorious counterattack. In the grand, tragic epic of Leningrad's resistance, 2 pathways have been immortalized in the annals of history, their names whispered with reverence: the road of life and the road of victory. They were more than just supply routes. They were arteries of hope, conduits of defiance against a seemingly certain doom. The road of life, Doroga Zhizhny, was born of the brutal Russian winter. As the fascist armies controlled every land route, nature provided a desperate, fleeting alternative: the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga. When the ice grew thick enough to bear weight, a stream of Gaz AA trucks began a perilous journey across its vast, white expanse. Day and night, in the face of blinding blizzards and temperatures that could freeze a man solid in minutes, these trucks moved in a constant, fragile convoy. They were relentlessly hunted by German artillery positioned on the southern shore and by Luftwaffe pilots who strafed and bombed the ice road at every opportunity. Many trucks broke through the fractured ice, their drivers entombed in a freezing grave, their precious cargo lost to the depths. Yet for every truck lost, many more made it through. They carried not just guns and ammunition, but something far more precious: flour, tins of meat, medicine, and fuel. On their return journey from the city, they carried the most vulnerable, emaciated children, the sick and the wounded, evacuating them to the mainland. The road was a fragile thread, the number of trucks severely limited, but it was enough. It solved just barely the immediate crisis of mass starvation and provided the fuel to keep a few key factories running. It was a symbol that Leningrad was not alone, that the motherland had not forgotten them. In the summer of 1942, when the ice melted, the heroism continued. Under the cover of darkness and constant threat of attack, Soviet engineers accomplished an extraordinary feat. They laid a 25-kilometer-long oil pipeline and a high-voltage electrical cable, the cable of life, on the bed of Lake Ladoga. This incredible achievement signaled the revival of Leningrad's heavy industry, allowing the factories to once again produce the tanks and heavy weapons needed for the city's defense. The Red Army also launched a series of fierce amphibious assaults to secure key islands and coastal areas on the lake, gradually wresting control of this vital waterway from the Germans.
If the road of life was about survival, the road of victory, Doroga Победы, was about the future. It was a testament to the Red Army's growing strength and the shifting tides of the war. Following the success of Operation Iskra in January 1943, which broke the blockade and opened a narrow land corridor to the city, Soviet engineers worked with breathtaking speed. They laid a temporary bridge across the Neva River and laid a makeshift 33-kilometer-long railway line directly into Leningrad. This was the road of victory. It was a permanent, high-capacity link to the rest of the country. The road of life and the road of victory entered history as the enduring symbols of the city's indomitable spirit. They were the lifelines that defeated General Winter and General Hunger, the twin allies of the Wehrmacht. Though the bombs and shells had not yet ceased to fall on the city streets, these two strategic arteries marked the definitive bankruptcy of the German plan. Hitler's strategy to strangle Leningrad, to crush it with firepower, freeze it with ice, and starve it into submission had failed. The legendary defensive posture established and maintained by the Red Army and the city's people was more than just a holding action. It was an active, bleeding wound in the side of Army Group North, tying down dozens of elite German divisions that were desperately needed on other fronts. This monumental defense, in concert with the heroic efforts of the supply lines, set the stage for the final act. The Soviet forces, no longer just surviving, but now resupplied and re-energized, began to organize the powerful counteroffensives that would not only liberate their city, but would mark one of the greatest military comebacks in human history. A thunderous blow struck directly at the heart of Hitler's mad ambition for global domination.
The story of Leningrad is a tapestry woven from threads of unimaginable suffering and unparalleled courage. It is a testament to the depths of human cruelty and the heights of the human spirit. The defense of this city was not just a battle, it was a crucible that tested the very limits of endurance and revealed a will to live that refused to be extinguished. It remains a sacred chapter in the history of a world at war, a solemn reminder of the price of freedom and the terrible cost of tyranny.